all of you sentient beings should believe in this sutra that is named Praise of the Inconceivable Virtues and Protection by All Buddhas. All right. So we will talk about Pure Voice Buddha, which is the first Buddha in the Zenith direction. And according to Master Ching Kong, Venerable Master Ching Kong, Pure Voice Buddha represents the effective verbal method of teaching sentient beings in the Saha world. The Saha world is our world. And in this world, one of the most effective ways in communication is speech. And so speech is very important. And especially during the Buddha's time where there was no writing, speech was the main method of communication. So today we'll talk about pure voice and impure voice. And we'll look at about criticisms, how to handle criticisms. We'll talk about receiving criticisms from others, giving criticisms to others, and how to handle criticisms. I think that is very applicable in today's modern times. Okay. Pure Voice Buddha voice is a means, a main way to help others, to encourage others. We use our voice to encourage others, and we use our voice to expound the Dharma. And of course, the best voice is that of the pure voice. And the pure voice is really a manifestation of our pure mind and selflessness. Every Buddha's manifestations, something that we can see from our body, like our facial expressions, the way that we exhibit ourselves, those are all manifestations of our merits and virtues. A person who looks very kind, you know that his heart is kind, or her heart is kind. So when you walk into that person's atmosphere, you can feel the comfort, you can feel the peacefulness, and that is because of that person's merits and virtue from their cultivation. So pure voice is a manifestation of that person's cultivation, person's merits and virtues. And of course, pure voice comes from pure mind, and pure mind is a mind of selflessness. And of course, impure are criticisms with the intention to discredit and hurt others. So what is the consequence of unskillful intentions to hurt others with criticisms? Well, because of that karma effect, then in future when conditions come to fruition that we may have the same faults, we can become easy targets for criticisms. We may try our best, even with the best intentions, to do good deeds, but somehow we end up receiving criticisms. So it could be our karmic consequence in the past. And so that's a consequence of criticizing people with the intention to hurt. And another consequence is that we may not be able to perform skillful deeds, may not be able to cultivate merits successfully. We will get obstructions. People will be there to obstruct us, to make things harder for us, and we may give up. We may not have the strength to overcome those obstructions. And the third consequence is that we may lose our credibility. For example, we have a person who comes up to us and always criticizes somebody else. It's a good chance that they will criticize us as well behind our backs. And so if a person who always criticizes other people, it's very hard for us to have any trust in that person. And so that's the consequence of criticizing, ridiculing other people behind their back. So that's a negative karmic consequence, right? And of course, if we can't we don't have that trust and credibility, it's very easy for us to give up and to not have impact in what we do. And so criticisms are really they have really significant impacts to our cultivations and our way of life. And so we should be careful when how we deal with people verbally, right? And if we criticize people and we deplete our merits, then when it's our turn to do something, to pursue a goal, it's going to be very difficult. We won't be able to convince others to support our cause. We won't be able to convince other people to do good deeds because they sense the credibility issues because of our karmic consequence. And so we should I think, observe this a little bit more and be careful in how we communicate with others. What does this mean to us then? How should we be careful? Is we should inspect ourselves, right, our behavior, and try correct any faults as soon as possible, and avoid focusing on other people's faults. This is an ancient teaching, not to focus on other people's faults and avoid criticizing other people's mistakes and embarrassing them publicly. Because if we have lost our merits through our unskillful deeds, it's easy for us to encounter failures. But of course, this is not to say that we should become self-centered and ignore other people. When we, the old sayings like mind your own business, we shouldn't take that literally, because if we misunderstand that teachings, then we'll just become more self-centered, more self-focused, and we don't care about other people. So the teachings are paying attention to your own faults and don't mind about other people's faults. We should not take that too literally. For example, if we see our good friends making mistakes, we know we have faults, but we can see very clearly that our friend has made a mistake. We should have a compassionate heart to point out their mistakes so that they can improve. When we're taught not to focus on other people's faults, it doesn't mean that we should be self-centered and not pay attention of other people's and try to help them where we can. Right? If we see somebody who has fault and we have decided not to pay attention to them, not to focus in helping them, in other words, we're ignoring the pitfalls that they're falling in, then we could lose our ability to see things very clearly because we have decided to not see the opportunity to help other people. When we have deprived ourselves of opportunities, those opportunities could close up on us. So we have to keep that balance. One is to focus on our own faults and try to correct them if we have any, and most likely we do. And when we say not to focus about other people, it's to avoid criticizing other people, embarrass them publicly, but not to ignore them. If it is within our ability to help our friends, then we should bring up those mistakes and communicate with a friend to help overcome the mistakes. Because otherwise, we're ignoring the problem. We have been given an opportunity to help, but we are ignoring it. And so we could lose our ability to see things clearly. So we should be kind in correcting ourselves, be kind to ourselves, but also be kind in helping others, right? There should be a balance. And seeing other people making mistakes, and we choose not to help them, but to ignore them, then the consequence is that we could end up making mistakes, and there will be nobody to help us. A famous story, well-known story in Buddhist scriptures is the Angulimala, who killed 1,000 people according to the scriptures, right? He was wrong in his learning, and he was taught to kill people, but his peers, even his teachers, encouraged him, didn't even correct his mistakes, right? So he eventually carried out that wrongful learning, and he became a serial killer, killing hundreds of people. So there was nobody there to help him to correct his mistakes, except for the Buddha, who was so courageous, so brave in meeting this serial killer, where everybody was running away for their lives. But the Buddha was so brave to meet the serial killer, and so was so compassionate in helping the serial killer to recognize his mistakes. Without the Buddha's help, Angulimala would have been reborn in the realms of hell because of his killing. And so he was fortunate enough to have encountered the Buddha to help him, right? So if we see somebody who's making a mistake, our friends, especially those who we have affinity with, friends, family, we should be courageous in bringing out those mistakes in a smarter way, in a clever way, not to embarrass them publicly. If they've done something that we think is wrong, we should bring that up. And otherwise, they think that they may have done nothing wrong, and they think that is acceptable. And that is a really big mistake when they don't understand themselves that is a mistake. Because let's say at home, a child who is mischievous, but because love-caring parents wants to provide this love and caring to the child, and the child thinks that by being mischievous, it's okay, it's acceptable. But when he goes into the world is not going to accept his mischievous behavior. And so by not bringing out that mistake, call out a mistake to correct that child, we are hurting the child, right? So when we are taught to focus on ourselves, correct our mistakes, and don't mind other people's business, we should not take it literally, but we should use our wisdom to do the best we can to make things better, right? I mean, and in a spiritual community, we Buddhists, as Buddhist practitioners, we have faults. We're still mundane beings, so we have faults. And if we don't help each other to correct faults, and we're here, we're taught to be humble, to be quiet. But if we don't bring up things that are blatantly bad, then the whole community is bad. I was part of at work, we're trying to bring social issues that have been going on and to make that as an open conversation so that employees don't feel fear. So I really applaud our leadership for doing that. And one of the comments that the leaders, one of the panelists made was that in Asian society where we're taught just to do our best work and just heads down and just do your work and don't say anything. But he said that may be not applicable in this modern society, in particular in the society that we live in, because a lot of bad things going on, and if we just don't acknowledge and don't bring out into the open, it could be a problem, right? You will have social, racial issues, but yet we don't bring out and it's going to be a problem. I mean, what do you think? We've been brought up in the Asian culture just to be quiet and just do our work and just don't make noise, don't rock the boat, just do as you're told, and you should be okay. But in today's society, I mean, what do you think? Is that acceptable?
I think for nowadays, it's not as acceptable anymore, because if by not saying anything, you're in a way accepting what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
So when the time is right and there's a purpose, when you need to say something, you need to say something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How about Lo Lao Sư?
Well, I'm just thinking before we so-called like to tell people what is right, the right thing to do, we have to first of all look down a little bit. I mean, lower our head a little bit, like thinking, if I am using and if I'm saying this with the criticism, make sure we are not trying to use this chance to show that we are above that. Mm-hmm. Okay. Oh, and we're beyond. Yeah. Like you're beyond that, and then so the voice can really have some more like empathy in it,
Mhm.
not like
Yeah.
criticizing.
Right.
And that will be easier for everybody to take this as a good advice.
Yeah, I think that that's a good point that we should be careful in how we bring up these sensitive issues, and these issues are societal issues, and they should not be ignored. But they are very sensitive, and if we see something that's wrong that we and collectively is not acceptable in society, it should be brought up and it should not allowed to happen, because there are people who may not have the courage to bring things up, and it's not easy. It takes a lot of courage to step up, because you could be offending people with different views, right? But if it is wrong, if it's hurtful, and if it's unacceptable in our society, then it should not be tolerated. Because if it's nobody says something, like Cindy, like you said, that means you're tolerating it. You're not saying anything. You're not voicing against it. Then you're tolerating it. But sometimes people think, okay, well, I'm gonna voice it up, but then sometimes it's really their own opinions, and they're just their own biased view. And so we have to balance that, and we have to be careful. But the point here is that the point here is we should not be passive, but we should do the right things to help others. Yeah.
One more word, what I tried to say was we should avoid to use the kind of mindset that we are trying to address misbehavior.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that will cause some kind of backlash.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Okay. There are things that we can consider when critiquing other people. When we, for example, one is not to discredit or embarrass and disclose other people's faults publicly. And we all have our conscious of ourselves in the sense of our ego. And the best way for people to be receptive is not to embarrass them, even though they have faults, but we should not embarrass them publicly, but we should take them to the side and say, hey, what you did was not appropriate. Let's think about it. By not discrediting, embarrassing others, we are preventing them from losing faith and regressing and giving up too. If we are too harsh on their fault, and we're at a positions where we can do that, and our subordinates, maybe if it's too harsh for them, they could give up, or our friends, or they have faults, they know they have faults, and it's tough for them to overcome those faults. They're trying, and we may not see their efforts, but if we bring out their faults, them weaknesses in the public too early, we could discourage them from advancing, meaning that we will deprive them the opportunity to improve. Right? And the second is when we critique people, that we should truly care about others, just like Lord CJ mentioned, that we do want them in our hearts, we do want them to be better and to be happier. So before we criticize other people, we should check, reflect in our heart, do we want them to be happy? How is this going to help them? They may not receive very positively, and it's really up to them to decide how to receive it. But I think one thing that we can control is, do we have the compassionate heart and the willingness to help them, and not just to satisfy our own ego, right? Because people will be more receptive to advice when we truly care about them, when they can feel that, and they know that, because in interacting with them, we have been sharing with them what we have, right? We're sharing our foods, we're sharing our time to help them. So we have established that relationship, that trust, that bond. And so when we say something, give an advice, they know that it's coming from our true heart, and not to discredit them. And because we've been there to help them through tough times, so they can trust us. And so when we have that strong foundation, and it's coming from a true heart, then it's easy for them to receive it as a gift, not as a punishment. And of course, if the advice is proper, then the listener should take it as an advice. When we give other people advice, and we should understand that it is from our true heart. But on the receiver side, we should also understand whether it's proper or not. But on the giver side, giving them advice, we should also understand that is this advice proper? Because not everybody can stand up to the truth, right? I mean, sometimes you have to sugarcoat things a little bit, and it depends on people's ability, whether they can take it or not. And so it's not just from a true heart and you can say whatever you want, but it requires a little bit of cleverness in terms of deciding whether that is proper or not for that person. So before we criticize others, we should reflect internally. Have we offered them compassion, caring? Have we tried our best to care for them before we offer them advice? And before that one gives advice to others, we should practice compassion, a loving kindness towards others. If not, then we should be very selective in the words that we say, because those words may come out. It's a reflection of our heart, right? The things that we do, the words that we say, they are all reflection of what's in our mind. And so we should be selective about it. And of course, it's better to wait until we have helped them and to have that trust, that bond before we provide advice to them, right? And if otherwise we don't, if we hurt them, then of course that could deplete our merits. And it's really merits that commands attention. If we have merits, people will listen to us. So as opposed to forcing our advice on them, if they reject our advice, then we know that we don't have the affinity and we don't have the merits yet to convince them. So there's no point in trying to force them into our thinking and trying to fit the mold, you will. Because if you have merits, it's very easy to command attention, right? With great merits, the great merit is in transforming people, helping them from evilness to goodness to sagehood. If we can help somebody who become good, become skillful, become awareness of themselves, avoiding mistakes, that is very meritorious. And it is said that bodhisattvas spent eons, kalpa of time to cultivate merits to perfect that one single skill. So that's why they have achieved perfections, and they can help all sentient beings because they spend a lot of time cultivating merits. And so we too, before we quickly jump into giving people's advice, that we should cultivate more merits in order to be effective. Because if you're not ready, you spend a lot of time in helping them and a lot of energy, and they don't receive it, then that's a waste of energy. Therefore, we should do our homework and have that preparation so that our efforts would not be wasted. So when giving advice, we should not be said in a tone of a teacher, like Lord Sijie mentioned, right? That we're sharing, we're not in a position to teach anybody. And that we should say it in a way to preserve their dignity and integrity, and not just to point out mistakes and embarrass them, since we think it's good for them. Well, it may not be good for them, and so we should try to point out the positives, right? Or the positive points, and show them a way to become even better. So they may have accomplished something, but if we found a way for them to become even better, then we should show them a better way. And so when we have compassion and caring, they will be more receptive, and they'll receive it very naturally. So for example, if our friends are generous in givings and they're kind, and we will feel very comfortable with them, right, asking their advice because we know that they're generous, and we will not be embarrassed in approaching them for advice because we know that they'll keep it confidential. We have that trust. So when we offer that trust, and we can keep the secrets and we can make it confidential and not relay that to other people, we have this bond, this trust, and it's very easy for them to approach us naturally without fear of being embarrassed. Just like likewise, right? If we have always been helpful towards others, and people are nice back to us, I mean, they want to treat us out for a meal, for example. If we've been nice, we will not feel embarrassed or shy in accepting their offers. On the contrary, if a person is always refusing to accept offers, then that person is not exercising his or her compassion. So we're receiving not because we want that object, but we're receiving because we want to establish, strengthen that bond of friendship and the opportunity for that person to practice giving. So when we receive, it is our compassion that we receive. So again, things to consider when criticizing other people is make sure that they are not being embarrassed publicly, that their faults are not being disclosed publicly, and that we should have built a strong foundation before criticizing other people, because they may, if we lack the merits, they will not have that trust. We will not be able to command attention, and we could end up hurting them. Okay.
I just suddenly realized this is really, really important between husband and wives also.
Yeah.
Just saying, like, especially as a wife, if you want to criticize your husband, you better make sure that you're not whatever you're complaining about, you better not be doing the same thing to your husband. I don't know, I just thought this was pertinent to husband and wives.
Yeah. No, I mean, at the beginning, during the dating phase, people are madly in love and they tend to see only the positive side. And then after you feel comfortable, it's like after the deal is sealed, then you put down your guard, right? You put down the show, and then now the truth of that person is exposed. But it's not exposed, it's always there, it's always been there, but we have chosen not to see. So in a marriage, yeah, it depends on that person's temperament. Some people are really sensitive with the ego, and they could feel hurt very easily. And so as a husband or wife, I mean, it's the responsibility of both parties to protect that relationship, right? That relationship is like another being. You have your own needs. The spouse has his or her own needs, and then the relationship has its own need. So it's like another person that you have to feed and care.
It's just especially true about not criticizing them, not embarrassing them or doing anything in public, because especially, I don't know, for men, they're very,
Very egoistic.
their ego is very important to them, and
Yeah.
the last thing you want to do is
Yeah.
embarrass them.
Yeah, and that's sometimes tough in modern society where women have the same opportunities to advance their career, and sometimes the spouse, the husband, might not have the same chance to advance very quickly, and so that could be, some people, that could be hurtful because they feel insecure now. So that insecurity can take a toll on the relationship, because that relationship is made up of both parties, right? But if the husband could be made to think that this is good for him as well as the relationship, the family. So I think that instead of focusing on one person, in my opinion, is to focus on the greater good, right? The good of the family, and that our family has a chance to advance together. There will be people not advancing at the same rate, but when one person advances, the whole family advances. And so if we could make to be seen that way, then it's not on just one person, but it's really the whole group And that's how Buddha's view. It's not just about him achieving enlightenment, but for the better good of the whole, all sentient beings, because there is no ego. And no ego doesn't mean you don't put in the effort and you don't care. But no ego here means whoever has the opportunity to advance, we should support that person, because that person is going to bring more benefits to more people. Right? We may have the opportunity, let's say, but we don't have the ability. But the next person has the ability, we should offer. Just like in a basketball game, you have the ball, you can foul, you can throw out however you want, and you could make that shot and gain fame, or you could miss it. But if there's another, your teammate is in a position to make the shot, and you're being blocked, then you should pass the ball to that person, even though everybody's looking to you to make the last shot, and you're gonna be the most valuable player, MVP of this the year. But if your teammate is in a clear position to make the shot, and that should be passed on. So that's wu, right? That's Vongya, that's ego, no ego, egoless. And so when we study Buddhism, we see things very clearly, that whoever is in the position to score, then we should provide opportunity, support that opportunity to that person. And so in this case, in the relationship, who is this person who's going to score? Well, it's the relationship, right? If the relationship is healthy, sometimes as a husband and wife, we have to put in that sacrifice, but it is the better for the relationship. And so, and yeah, one way is to be clever in how we provide feedback, right? That feedback could be seen as criticism, or could be seen as advice, and depends on how we approach it. I mean, sometimes, and you can see this in a friendship. At the beginning, when we lack merits, we lack the ability to communicate. Whenever we say something, even with the best advice, it was seen as criticism. But after a while, we gain experience, and we say it. Now it is seen as advice, and so you can see the change. So one way is not just only to focus on ourselves to correct, but also on other people too. So we shouldn't take the teachings too literally, but we should reflect and use the wisdom to decide when is a good time. Is this the right thing for the team? Is this going to make the team better? Is this going to make the relationship better? Right? Even though I'm going to bite my tongue not to say it publicly, but if it's good for the team, then yes, and that's I would not say it, but it should be said. If it is a fault, it should be said. Otherwise, you will not help that person to improve. So it needs to be brought out, but in a clever way, right? So thank you for that input. So definitely, it is something to consider, that we don't want to embarrass other people, but we, in our hearts, we do want others to improve or to be better with our observations and our offerings. Right? So when others criticize us, how should we take that? Right? Things to consider. Well, we should not discard it immediately, but we should listen and determine whether the criticism is valid or not. Sometimes we jump to conclusions, say, because based on that person's behavior or reputation, what we heard from that person, and when that person criticizes us, we discard it. We jump to conclusion right away. And so in other words, we are depriving ourselves from the opportunity to learn from the situation. The situation may be insignificant, and may not be of any value, but it is of value because it has occurred. It is now part of our life, right? It is now part of us, so it is related to us in one way or another. So if the criticism is valid, then we should seek to correct our faults. If it is not valid, then we should be mindful of our words and actions to avoid future misunderstanding. Right? Because there's a reason why that person is criticizing us. It may not be a fault, but that person is criticizing us, and we should be mindful that why is that person is criticizing us, and to avoid a misunderstanding in the future. Okay. And second thing is to be mindful of our behavior and feelings. There are 3 levels. Whenever we receive something, there are 3 levels that we respond to. One is without recognitions of our own anger and frustration. Right? We react emotionally, and we clearly display our emotions. We get riled up, we fume, we use words that are not in a dictionary, and so that's a sign. I mean, it's a very clear sign that that person has lost their awareness. Okay? So in this case, one way to deal with this is to physically do something to mitigate it. For example, walk out of that situation. If we can't control ourselves in that situation, we should walk out of that situation. Maybe drink a cold glass of water, or just to get some fresh air. If we can't control our emotions, we should remove ourselves from that environment. The second is recognizing our own anger and frustration, but we don't display our anger. But inside we're still angry, right? We can recognize it, but we can't control it. So in this case, you can use visualizations. You can use rationalizations to help you understand the situation, that it is not worth agonizing over the situation, that things are not as bad as may seem. And so you can use rationale to help you to calm down. So that's the second level. And you can still be within the situation, within the conversation. At the same time, you use your wisdom to try to help rationalize things out. The third level is recognizing the initial thought of anger before anger arises, right? At the back of our head, there's a thought of anger that's where we're getting excited, and we subdue it right away. And we're using control, and we don't suppress our emotions. So there's a difference between control and suppression. We don't want to suppress our emotions. From Sangha, and he says that there is a subtle difference between the two. Control and not suppress, because if you suppress something, you're really allowing your energy to build up, and it could burst. Right, all your emotional energy, you are not allowing it to a way to escape and therefore it could build up and it could burst. And you may have controlled it, but really you don't, because it could explode at any time. And one way of thinking about control in a more aesthetic way, in terms of like an artist, right, controlling his paintbrush or controlling his material. So fully utilizing his abilities, his materials perfectly and fully. So that's control, right? You're not forcing it, but it is within your control. Like how we communicate, we can control the situation, but we're not suppressing ourselves or forcing other people to accept. So that's that's control. That's true control, as opposed to suppress. Suppress is you using force. You're using your influence to force other people to accept. So that's suppression. And they may accept it because they don't have any other way to overcome, to get out. So they will accept, but they are being suppressed. So control is not in a harsh, repressive, or forcible sense, but controls here, he said controls means control. If that's helpful. So repression is now being unable to do anything when, as a result of that repression, things start breaking up later on. That is not control. So control, even though we think that we have things under control, but when we suppress, things will get out of control sooner or later, right? Okay. And the third thing to consider when criticizing other is, and we're not mindful and we're not correcting our own negativity. We are nurturing our own negativity. So in other words, if somebody's giving us criticisms, and if we have our own negativity and we're not acknowledging our negativities and not trying to improve, it can make us more defensive. For example, at work, we have been asked to give a technical presentation. And in the audience, you have a group of your peers and managers as well, management team coming to our presentations. And there's one person in the meeting who does not have the technical background of that subject. We know that based on the questions that they ask. And so we try to explain the topic with more technical details, but it doesn't help. And it will only make him, he becomes more lost, and it will only lead to even more questions. And then eventually the meeting gets out of control, and it digresses to another conversation. At the end of the meeting, our boss is not happy with our presentation, maybe because it has happened several times in the past with our presentations. So then what do? How should we react? Any idea? Any idea? And so we're giving this presentation, we try our best, but then it didn't go out well, and our boss is not happy the way that it turned out. So it seems like he's like blaming us for the bad outcome of the meeting. What should we do, and how should we react?
Well, I know you shouldn't be defensive because that's just going to make it worse.
Yeah.
But maybe you could say, okay, so maybe you can work with your boss to ask for suggestions about what
Yeah.
you should do. Or,
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's what I would do too, is to talk to, if I were in that situation, I would talk to my boss and say, okay, what exactly do you mean? What went wrong exactly? As opposed to say, oh, you were terrible. And that's too general. Like, it doesn't help, right? So yeah, I would sit down with my boss and ask him, oh, what exactly that you think didn't go well during the meeting? Anything specific, and then we'll work on that. Because sometimes, maybe it's the way that we explain too. We think that it's very clear, and especially when a person is very technical, it is all clear in your head, right? But when you try to explain it to somebody who's not technical, who's not involved, and then it's not very clear to them. And it happens all the time. Like, that problem you see in that person is so clear. Like, why can you not see that it's a problem? But it is not clear to them. So it's the way that we communicate. We make a lot of assumptions in our head. And that's what's causing bias and prejudice, because we assume that the things that we have in heads are very clear and very righteous, but they're not to other people. Yeah, so one way is to acknowledge that, yes, the meeting did not go well because it digressed. You didn't get what you want out of it, and the audience was not satisfied, right? At least that person was not satisfied with the presentation. So perhaps there's something that could have been said differently. And so you use that as an opportunity to learn, as opposed to discard, say, no, that person is clearly, he is ignorant. He doesn't know what he's talking about. And so that I should not listen to him. But if we want to be successful, we have to accommodate more people, right? The more successful you are, the request for accommodation, the demand for accommodation is very high, right? The Buddha has to accommodate all sentient beings. So he has to set in different ways to different people. So same thing too, we should not limit ourselves. If we have achieved something, we can communicate to our peers, and our peers are technical. That's one level of communication that we have achieved. Now let's broaden that so that we can expand our comfort zone and expand how we communicate. Like when I communicate in class, it's differently. But if I were to talk to somebody who's not involved with our organization in a different way, and sometimes may not be perfect, but I learn how people communicate differently and to make it more acceptable, right? So of course, that's something that we can consider. But another thing that we could consider is that when that person challenged us during the meeting, was he doing that to give us a hard time, to embarrass us in public, or was he showing true interest in our presentation and wanted our presentation to be clear? Right? So there's also that side of the coin to consider too. If somebody who is there just to embarrass us publicly and has no intention to help, then we should not pay too much attention to that person because it's garbage. But if that person does have the intention to help our presentation, to help the team, because after our presentation, we have to pitch it to another group. So if we can learn from that, then the next time that we pitch to another group, we'll be more successful. As opposed to if that person is there to just to get back at us because that person has lost the opportunity to make the presentation, then we should not put too much emphasis on that, right? So it depends on temperament. So it comes back to what we talked earlier, is providing that before providing the feedback is, do we truly want that person to improve, to be better? And if we are so fortunate to have somebody to give us feedback in a way that we can improve, that is really a fortune. Otherwise, we could hurt ourselves without knowing, right? Yeah.
One little thing. It's that I think it's always good for us to use a little more like empathy. So to start with our own experience, like if I want to talk about like your missing work, and I would say, I remember there was a time when this happened to me, then it caused this kind of consequences.
Yeah.
Then I would I learned how to try to avoid this. So at this moment, I see you have this similar situation.
yeah.
So maybe I can give you some
Oh,
of
yeah,
my
I mean,
experience.
Empathy is a very important factor in getting people to be more receptive. Yeah, we are offering advice as somebody who has gone through it, and we're offering lessons learned. Right? We're not teaching that person, but we're offering advice, and we can relate to that person more by sharing our experience. Yeah, I've gone through it, and I see that you're struggling with this. Maybe we can work together, and I can give you some directions, and you can be better, right? Or you can, for example, you see somebody who's doing great work, and you acknowledge that great work. You're very diligent. You're hardworking, but I've gone through this, and you may want to consider this. There's another way to do it better, so that you can be more efficient. You can do things. You can finish things quicker and not having to require so much time to complete those things. And yeah, so definitely a factor of empathy will help in building that trust, that we're not there to teach that person. We're not there to to empower ourselves in that positions of teaching, but we are there just to help each other, right? So that spirit, that mindset is that we are here together. We're in this together. I'm going to help you. You're going to help me. And together we grow as a team. Right? Okay, so how should one deal with negative feedback? It was a question that was asked. And how can one accept or see it differently, from different perspective, especially if one doesn't agree with, right? Not everything that people provide us, feedback to us, we agree. Could be valid, could be invalid. But how do we deal with negative feedback? Before we conclude it as negative, but we should listen objectively whether it is valid or not. Otherwise, we could be very defensive. So, for example, this is what Shankar Sita mentioned about receiving criticisms. Right? He said that there's a link between defensiveness and receiving criticisms. And a person becomes defensive is when they are taxed with their shortcomings, and they're likely to be more defensive in dealing with criticisms. So instead of accepting criticisms in a positive manner, they react with anger and resentment, right? And because they know that they are in a weak position. Of course, this is from the perspective that the criticisms is proper, and that we have something to gain from it. But if the criticism is not valid, then of course we should not treat it so significantly. But we should focus on something that's positive. So again, this is from the perspective that there is something for us to learn, and that criticism is proper. So how are they being defensive? Well, these are common rebuttals, right? I'm not angry. You always misunderstand me. Why can't you say something positive for a change? So the word always comes up a lot in that kind of defense. And so when we hear always, either from ourselves or from other people, then we know that we are being defensive. Right? I mean, when they say that, what is meant here is that I'm aware of the problem. Okay, there is a problem I need to address, and I need time to think about it. I need time to work it out. In other words, they're asking for help in an egoistic way. But instead of being able to say this, they rationalize the other person's actions. Like you're always using the word always in their expression. So this is defensiveness. Right? We distract attentions from the objective situation by attacking the bona fides of the person who points it out and playing the injured, innocent, or whatever. When a person is being defensive, then they are seeing themselves as innocent. They're being the victim of the situation. And so before we create that kind of rift between ourselves and our friends, we have to be prepared to be open with them, have sufficient confidence in them to be able to confess our shortcomings. So another reason that we become defensive is perhaps because we don't trust that person. We think that that person may end up using our shortcomings against us in the future. Therefore, we shut down and we try to defend ourselves. So if we are in that situation, then we should ask, is there a trust issue here? Right? We have confessed in the past and it has been used against us, and therefore we are not going to do that again. We're going to be defensive. And that's what's causing, what could elevate the situation. So if you're the person doing the criticizing, he says, it should be done in a skillful manner with kindness and encouragement. Nor should there be any pretense that you yourself are well clear of the particular shortcoming. So in fact, it is a good idea to be explicit about this and say, perhaps, says, I know this failing only too well from my own experience. Why don't we tackle it together? Just like Lord Sijie here said, right? So that's a very good approach, is empathy, the factor of empathy in helping other people to be more receptive. If you just say, come on now, don't be dishonest with yourself. This is a problem. Why don't you acknowledge it? Of course, this is suggesting that the dishonesty is on the other person's problem. Now we're finger pointing, and that's not going to help, because that's just going to make that person even more defensive. But if we were to say, let's face it, as always, as honest with ourselves as we might be, but here's a problem that we have to work together, in order to overcome it. So this should be said in full consciousness that it is really something you yourself need to work on as well. So it's not just lip service, but we do acknowledge our own shortcomings, and we see other people, that person's shortcoming, and we acknowledge that it should be, we should put in the efforts to work together to improve that, right? So we are simply concerned with the elimination of skillful mental states. Whether they are yours or mine is virtually irrelevant. Let's work together to eliminate unskillful mental states from the world. This is the Bodhisattva attitude, right? In the Bodhisattva attitude, there's suffering in this world, but the Bodhisattva doesn't see, oh, this is my suffering, that's your suffering, that's the other person's suffering. It's sad to be you. But to a Bodhisattva, there's just suffering. It doesn't belong to any particular person because they're egoless. So just like the example we talked about, the team, the relationship is suffering. It doesn't matter who suffering it is, it's the relationship, and the team will have to help. Otherwise, it's not going to improve. Okay, so the Bodhisattva's attitude is the suffering, the problem does not belong to any particular person. We're all in this together, and so it's helpful for us to be together to solve this problem. He said that it's always easy to see the faults of the others, but pointing them out can be an unskillful activity in itself, meaning that even though it may be, we have every right to point out, and we're correct that that person is the fault, but it is unskillful if we're gonna point that out and make the situation worse, especially in public. For example, one may criticize someone as a preemptive strike, right? This can be a stratagem of slyness, concealment. One conceals one's own faults by getting one's criticisms in first. So that's how a defensive person tries to overcome the situation, is attack first before the other person attacks you. So in this situation, there needs to be a responsible person. A Bodhisattva would say, nobody owns the problem, I'm going to own the problem. I'm going to make things right. And sooner or later, the group will follow when it is the right thing to do. Right? So be the responsible person. Of course, being the responsible person is not easy. That means you have to take on the challenge and face a lot of complications at first, because like the first gear, right? The first gear requires a lot of power to push the car. But after you speed to 50 miles an hour, 60 miles an hour, the smaller gears can run. You don't need the larger gear, but it takes a big gear to move that heavy car. So it does take courage to be a responsible person. But if we're going to study Buddhism and be successful, we have to take on that challenge for ourselves and try our best to be that responsible person. He said that it can also happens that someone can be made a scapegoat. For one reason or another, they aren't very popular, and they have this sign, please kick me in the back. And if you have that sign, please kick me in the back, people will always happy to oblige to kick you in the back. So in other words, what we can learn from this is to maintain awareness and to prevent misunderstanding. Is the way that we carry ourselves, that people observe, that nonverbal communication that's making people to misunderstand what we're trying to say. So one way to overcome this is to be more mindful of ourselves and to avoid misunderstanding. In the Zen tradition, Chan Ting Dong, Chan Zong. In the Zen traditions, the teacher himself sometimes pick on an individual quite deliberately, and especially a person who is rather arrogant and pleased with himself, and makes him see himself as no more than a mass of faults, reduce him to just dust, and that is to teach that person, but not on anybody, but on a very particular kind of students, right? He said this is a dangerous approach and should be resorted to only by experienced teachers who definitely have that person's welfare at heart, who can clearly distinguish helping someone to break through from pushing them to breakdown. Yeah, because if you embarrass somebody and they're not up to that level, it is very dangerous because they can break down, they can give up. And he said that only very robust people with strong faults, strong natural self-confidence can stand up to that sort of treatment and benefit from it. So criticisms are important, it's part of growth, but it should be done cleverly in order to have any effectiveness. Right. So how do we deal with negative feedback in a normal life? How do we deal with people who give us negative feedback? Well, I think here is like one, before we make it define it as negative, we should understand, is it objectively negative before discarding it or concluding that it's negative. And this helps to prevent the illusory perceptions from arising too, because we have certain perceptions, certain bias in our thinking, and that's why we conclude it's negative. So before we make that conclusion, we as mundane beings, we know we have our own bias thinking. We should step back and take a good look at its validity. And this helps to prevent preconception of that person and the situation too. Sometimes that person may mean well, but the situation is making it seem like it is not. And we should ask ourselves, is there any use in that feedback, right? What can we learn from it? Why should we want to deal with it? So the words may be the same, but in different situations, they have different contexts. Especially when we lack merit and we say something, it means different. But after we have accumulated merit and we say the same thing, it means something different. And we should, in dealing with that negative feedback, we should ask, what is the motive of that person? Is that person trying to embarrass me, or is that person trying to help me? And also, what is the state of our mind in that situation? And when hearing the words of feedback, are we in a state of being receptivity, or a state of anger, emotional instability, where we may not receive it well? Okay. So in different situations, we can reflect. For example, if we recognize our own faults, do we put in the efforts to overcome our own faults and correct our own faults? If we can say that we have done our best to try our best, we may not be perfect, but we have tried our best to correct our own faults, then when we offer our advice, it comes out more genuinely. And when we are the kind of person who is always looking to improve, when we receive so-called negative feedback, we can always find something, gold nugget in that pile of trash. Right? Negative feedback may seem bad, but if we know how to look for gold, we can always find gold. Even amongst trash, we can find it. Among the negativity, we can always turn it around and see the positivity in it. And this will help us to overcome the illusion of sense perceptions. So consider this example. Look at this picture. Right? What do you see? Pencil. Yes, you see a pencil. You see a bent pencil, right? Our eyes are telling us that this pencil, this image, it is a bent object, a bent pencil. But we know that it is not bent. That's the pencil is straight. But because we're under the illusion of our sense perception, that we think it is bent. So not everything that we see and hear reflects reality. And it takes a little bit of thinking and wisdom, right? In other words, we have to overcome our sense perception, that illusion. So bodhisattvas have the same perceptions too, the same impressions like everybody else, but they do not mistake them for reality. They do not take their perceptions as being absolutely valid. they are not misled by appearances, just as when you see a pencil inserted in water, you know it is straight, even when it appears to be bent. So when we study Buddhism and we're trying to gain enlightenment, this is what it is to see reality and not be fooled by appearances. You don't judge a book by its cover. And you don't conclude that this is a bent pencil. But we know that it is a straight pencil by overcoming our illusions. So we have to feel very comfortable in accepting the reality by letting go of our illusion. That's how we know that this pencil is straight. If we cannot overcome our illusory perception, we cannot accept that this is a straight object, right? So what does that mean to see reality as to see dukkha, ku, right? Wu-tang, wu-wo. Dukkha, impermanence, no in changing self, right? Ko, wo-nya, wo-tu. So we should see that things can change. Because when we say that such and such in a criticism, we are categorizing that person to be permanently that way. And we're not acknowledging the reality that that person can change. So by seeing reality and not be fooled by appearances is to acknowledge the current situation, but at the same time to acknowledge the reality, the potentials of its changing nature, that it can change for the better or the worse, right? It could change either way. But we know that it can change, and that that person's behavior, that situation is not permanently bad or fixated. Okay? So when we receive feedback, and especially like a negative one that we cannot agree with, so why is it that we cannot agree with negative feedback? Well, there's so many reasons, right? One of which is that maybe the feedback is inaccurate and harmful, that we should not agree with it, right? It is not valid. The second is that one is too defensive to be objective about it and to accept the truth. And the third reason is that one should have the clarity as to why one is in disagreement. So before we conclude as negative, before that we decide to disagree with it, we should understand why we are disagreeing with it. We should have that clarity to overcome our perceptions, right? The illusion of our perceptions. Okay? Our physical senses give us a sense of perception through sight, hearing, taste, touch, and smell, but we have no evidence of what may be objectively there apart from that mediated by our senses. When we see something, when we conclude it is bad, but it is not reality, it is just because of our perceptions from our experience that we think it is bad. So in other words, we don't know whether whatever that we receive is negative or positive. And in order for us to see reality, we have to overcome that. We should not be misled by appearances. Our sense perceptions is what we perceive in our experience, and our experience will tell us this is bad. It's whispering in our ears that this is bad or this is good. And that's why some people can take on risks when they invest, right? Because they have the experience of being successful in stock picking, for example. They are confident in it, and from their experience, they have never failed before. They are likely to take on more risk. But a person who has encountered failures, like real estate investment, for example, they say real estate is bad. I'm never going to invest in real estate again. So it's based on their perception. What we conclude as good or bad is not the ultimate reality. I think we should remind ourselves that whatever that we conclude as good or bad may not be the ultimate reality. We really have to filter out a lot of biased thinking and a lot of our biased experiences to overcome that illusion. By understanding that, it helps us to see that things are truly empty. meaning that they're neither good nor bad. It's all based on our illusory perceptions. This is what Mr. Chen, he said, the 无记性, right? 无记性 is that it's very neutral. It's neither good nor bad. It is only based on our experiences, our biases, that we conclude good or bad. And so we cannot really trust our physical sense consciousness. They can fool us, right? Something that's blatantly, I mean, you see it blatantly bent, but you know that it's not bent. It's a straight object. We can interpret the situation however we want. We can interpret for the better or the worse. Of course, it's better to see the better side of things for ourselves and others. And of course, we're not saying to trick our mind to see things on the positive side. But if we could objectively look at the situations and learn from it, gain experience from it, then it is worth it. And in any situation, we can always gain from it, even though it may be negative feedback. It may be true or not true. We can gain from it. If it's true, then we take it, we learn from it, we correct it. If it's not, then we should figure out a way to avoid misunderstanding. Okay. Provide the proper inputs and conditions to generate proper desired results. And that's what conditionality is. Emptiness, 空 is 缘起, right? 冤ఖ, 空了, 冤ఖ. Emptiness tells us that by providing the proper inputs and the conditions, we can generate the proper results. So fundamental unclarity leads to unskillful actions, like anger. If we are not clear of why we are concluding as negative or positive, it leads to anger or desire, craving. If we conclude it's a good thing without clarity why it's good, it leads to desire to have it. If we conclude it's negative, it leads to desire, leads to anger. So one becomes increasingly out of touch, not because of one's unskillful activity, but because one insists on holding back from communicating. So you have blocked emotions. You don't communicate anymore. You repress the anger, or you feed this desire, this craving, right? So how one reacts determines whether one is misled by reality or not, right? If we have negative mindset, with a negative mindset, and in interacting with that situation, we continue to push the cycle of life and death because we're feeding it. It's through our contacts and feelings. Now those links, we have contacts, it generates feelings. And if we have negative mindset, it will create anger. And that is a form of attachment. It's just a negative form of attachment. On the other hand, with a clear and calm mindset, we are making an exit from the cycle of life and death. And here, when I exit, I don't mean literally exiting this cycle and then go elsewhere. But when we exit the cycle of life and death, what it means is that we don't have any fear in dealing with situations. There's a lot of courage and bravery in us in dealing with situations. We are empowered with knowledge because we see things clearly. Therefore, there's no running away. When I say exit, unfortunately, I think it's an unfortunate translation. Escaping the cycle of life and death, the liberation, it doesn't mean that we're going to another place, but it means that we are now empowered to deal with things, to encounter things without fear, without suffering. Right? With attainment of insight into true nature of things, it is impossible for an unskillful mental state to arise in dependence upon a painful feeling. When we face something that is not very pleasant, we don't cause rise to hatred, to again continue to push that cycle, the wheel of life and death. Right? With feeling, as to whether it sustains attachment to or disentanglement from mundane experience. But I'm not saying that feelings is bad. Feelings, it can be a good thing because we use our feelings to encourage ourselves. Oh, this is painful. We should avoid it. This is pleasant. we should use it as a stepping stone for something better, right? So we use our feelings to give us directions, to guide us, but not to be stuck in it. From a personal point of view, life is divided into great classes: things that happen to us and things that we do. One is passive, one is active. We can't control what people say and what we hear because our ears are always open. We can't control the kind of feedback they'll provide to us, or the words that they choose to say. We cannot control that. But what we control is, what do we do after hearing the negative feedback or the positive feedback? What do we do? Do we become attached to it, or do we have a resentment against it? So this is something that's active rather than passive. What we decide to do with it is an active choice. So do we grow and rise above it, or do we get trapped in it? Right? Do we see the opportunity to learn, to rise above it, or do we get trapped in it? And this is emptiness, conditionality. All right. So to close this, in dealing with negative situations, right, we want to start releasing not just the anger and the pain, but the love and the delight and the appreciation that we have also perhaps repressed for too long. There is delight and appreciation, but we don't show it. We repress it. So that's not good too. We don't want to repress negative emotions like anger, but we also don't want to repress appreciation. When we appreciate somebody truly, we want to say that, thank you. Like Mr. Chen yesterday said, talk about thank you, I'm sorry, I love you. Those are good things to express, right? We don't repress anything. So the positive, once we get to it, is the great dissolver of negative. That's when we sit in meditation, we visualize compassion is to overcome our negativity, negative energy. With a strong meditation practice, if we are not seriously blocked, negative emotions may be dissolved without being consciously experienced at all. And we can start to relate to people powerfully and positively without going through that negative phase. So we don't have to experience pain in order to dissolve our own pain. Right? So again, I mean, the questions on how to deal with negative feedback is an open-ended question, because that question was asked without me understanding the situation. So therefore, I provided an open-ended answer. It's a vast answer, I understand. And it was done on purpose to cover all bases. I mean, this is meant to provide clarity and directions and not to provide a specific answer, because every situation is different. We should analyze the situations and try to bring out the best, right? And criticisms are part of our lives. We cannot go about our life without it. So what we have learned today is the harm and the benefits of criticisms. Right? When we see something that we can help somebody, we should help them. That's a benefit. But if one is done to embarrass other to discredit others, then that is harm. We learned about receiving criticisms and giving criticisms. Before we give criticism, reflect internally. Are we saying these words under the with the mindset of loving kindness or to discredit? And how to handle criticisms, right? Before jumping to a conclusion that whether it's negative or positive, we should recognize that there is illusory perceptions that is obstructing us, and we should overcome that illusory perceptions. Just like the pencil, we see that it's bent, but reality is that it is straight. And if we depend on our sense consciousness, the eyes, the ears, it may not reflect the true reality. Does it make sense? Any other comments? Okay, so that is pure voice Buddha. So what we learn again is there's pure and impure, and we should utilize the pure voice coming from a pure heart compassion to communicate, to expound the truth. All right. Okay, let's do merit dedication. Okay, please join your palms together. We recite. May the merits and virtues accrue today adorn the Buddha Pure Lands, repay 4 types of kindness above, and aid those suffering in the paths below. May those who see and hear of this bring forth the resolve for the Bodhi mind. When this retribution body is complete, together we shall meet in the land of ultimate bliss. All right, please rise. We bow to the Buddha 3 times to show our respect. First bow. Second bow. Third bow. Ami Tofo.